I want you to picture finding your own signature on an inspection report for a piece of machinery you have never, in your entire career, physically walked up to and inspected. Not a similar signature, not a typo. Your exact digital signature on a form dated 11 months earlier, certifying that a freight elevator at a plant 2 states away had passed a full safety inspection. An elevator that, as it turned out, hadn't been inspected by anyone at all in over 2 years. This is the story of Renata Kowalski and the 3 years of forged paperwork that finally came apart the week a maintenance worker nearly fell 4 stories because of it. Renata Kowalski was 33 years old, and she'd worked as a safety compliance coordinator at Ironclad Manufacturing Group for just over 4 years. Ironclad ran 6 mid-sized manufacturing plants across 3 states, producing industrial fasteners and structural components, heavy equipment, heavy machinery, the kind of workplace where safety compliance isn't a box-checking exercise for a corporate handbook. It's the difference between someone going home at the end of a shift and someone not going home at all. Renata's job was to manage the compliance calendar, tracking which equipment across all 6 plants was due for which inspection, coordinating third-party inspectors for the equipment that legally required outside certification, and maintaining the compliance file that regulators would review if anything ever went wrong. She didn't perform inspections herself for most equipment categories. She managed the process and reviewed the paperwork that came back from certified inspectors and from the company's own internal safety team. Her regional safety director was a man named Gary Holloway, 50, 22 years in industrial safety. A man who had, by every account Renata had ever heard before she started digging, built his reputation on exactly the kind of diligence the job demanded. He'd personally walked plant floors after 2 separate near-miss incidents years before Renata joined, and both times had pushed through equipment replacements that cost the company real money specifically because he refused to sign off on anything he thought was unsafe. That reputation was part of why nobody, including Renata for most of her 4 years there, ever thought to double-check his work. Here's what Renata didn't know for most of that time. A significant portion of Ironclad's mandatory equipment inspections, freight elevators, overhead cranes, pressure vessels, the categories that legally required certified third-party inspectors rather than internal staff, were being routed through a single inspection contractor Gary had brought on years earlier, a company called Sentinel Compliance Services. Sentinel had a solid reputation when Gary first onboarded them, competitive pricing, and a fast turnaround that made scheduling 6 plants worth of mandatory inspections considerably less painful for everyone involved. What actually happened, starting sometime around 3 years before this story reaches its turning point, was that Sentinel Compliance Services stopped actually sending inspectors to a growing share of these jobs. Instead, Gary would submit the equipment list and completed inspection reports, signed, dated, formatted exactly like the real ones, would come back within days, sometimes faster than a genuine physical inspection could possibly have happened given travel time between plants. Gary reviewed them, approved them, and the reports moved into Renata's compliance file exactly like every other legitimate inspection had for years. Renata's first 2 years, she had no reason to suspect anything. Paperwork came in on schedule, formatted correctly, signed by inspectors whose names she recognized from Sentinel's roster. The job, from where she sat, was working exactly the way it was supposed to. It was in her 3rd year that something small enough to nearly miss caught her attention. During a routine file audit, the kind of housekeeping task compliance coordinators do periodically, mostly to catch clerical errors before an actual regulatory audit finds them first, she noticed that an inspection report for an overhead crane at the Ohio plant listed an inspection date and time that placed the inspector, according to mileage and scheduling records from the same week, at the Tennessee plant, conducting an entirely different inspection at almost exactly the same hour. It was the kind of discrepancy that could plausibly be a data entry error. She flagged it as a minor correction request, expecting a quick fix and an apology from Sentinel's office staff. Instead, Gary handled it personally, the way he'd started handling more and more of the Sentinel-related paperwork himself, rather than routing it through normal channels. Scheduling error on their end, I'll get it corrected, he told her. Sentinels had some turnover in their back office. Don't worry about it. The correction came back within a day, with a fixed date that no longer conflicted with anything. Renata let it go, but the itch didn't fully go away, and about 2 months later, doing the same kind of routine file review, she noticed a second scheduling impossibility. This time an inspector supposedly completing full inspections at 2 different plants, 300 miles apart, on the same afternoon. This one she didn't flag through Gary first. She pulled up Sentinel's public business registration out of simple curiosity, the same kind of due diligence check she was technically supposed to run periodically on any long-term vendor anyway. Sentinel Compliance Services had exactly 2 employees listed on its most recent state filings, not 2 inspectors per region. 2 people, total, for a company that had, according to Ironclad's own compliance calendar, completed over 200 separate certified inspections across 6 plants in the previous year alone. 2 people cannot physically perform 200 certified mechanical and structural inspections across 3 states in a year. It isn't a question of diligence, it's a question of hours in a day. That was the moment Renata stopped assuming clerical error and started keeping a private file, quietly, cautiously, telling no one, because she understood immediately what she was potentially looking at. Over the following months, she built out a full cross-reference, treating it exactly like the compliance audits she ran professionally every year. Every Sentinel inspection report going back 3 years, cross-checked against inspector travel logs where she could obtain them, against equipment maintenance logs that sometimes contradicted the inspection findings entirely, and against a detail she almost hadn't thought to check, actual site access logs from plant security systems, which recorded every vehicle and visitor entering each facility. The pattern, once she'd built it out fully, was staggering. Of the roughly 210 Sentinel inspections logged over 3 years, site access records showed no matching visitor entry for 163 of them. No inspector had ever physically walked onto the property for 2 out of every 3 inspections Sentinel had supposedly performed and been paid for. She calculated what Ironclad had paid Sentinel for those phantom inspections. Just under $340,000 over 3 years for inspections that, as far as the actual physical record showed, had simply never happened. She still didn't have proof connecting this directly to Gary beyond his role approving and routing the paperwork, which was, after all, his actual job. It was entirely possible, in theory, that Sentinel was defrauding Ironclad without Gary's knowledge. She forced herself to consider that possibility seriously, but then she found the detail that made good faith negligence much harder to sustain as an explanation. Sentinel Compliance Services Business Reg. Station listed a registered agent she didn't recognize by name. But the business's originally filed address, from back when the company first incorporated, matched a property that county tax records showed was owned by a limited liability company, and that LLC's own formation documents, filed the same year Gary joined Ironclad, listed a managing member whose name Renata did recognize immediately, because she'd processed his direct deposit paperwork years earlier during an office systems migration, Gary Holloway. He hadn't just been trusting a vendor who happened to be defrauding the company. He had, as far as the public paper trail suggested, an ownership interest in the very shell inspection company he'd been routing hundreds of thousands of dollars toward for phantom work. Work that, when it was actually skipped, meant genuinely dangerous industrial equipment was going uninspected for years at a time on the strength of a piece of paper with a real inspector's name signed onto it by someone who had never set foot on the property. She sat with that discovery for several days before she let herself think about what it actually meant beyond the money. 210 inspections, 163 of them fabricated, freight elevators, overhead cranes, pressure vessels, equipment that, if it failed without warning, didn't produce a financial loss. It produced an injury, or worse, to someone doing their job on a factory floor who had every reason to trust that the safety certification tag on the equipment meant what it claimed to mean. That thought is what finally moved her from careful private documentation to action faster than she might otherwise have moved. She spent the next 3 weeks building the most rigorous case of her career, cross-referencing every fabricated inspection against the actual maintenance and incident history of each piece of equipment, flagging in particular 6 specific machines, 2 freight elevators, and 4 overhead cranes at 3 different plants that had gone the longest without any genuine inspection, some of them approaching 3 full years past their last verifiable, site-confirmed check. Before she finished the file, the decision was taken partly out of her hands. At the Tennessee plant, a maintenance technician named Ruben Alvarez was performing routine work near an overhead crane that had, according to Sentinel's paperwork, passed a full structural inspection only 4 months earlier. A support cable, corroded well past any safety tolerance that a genuine inspection would have caught immediately, failed under load. Ruben was not standing directly beneath the load when it happened, by what several people afterward called sheer luck, rather than any safety measure working as intended, and walked away with a fractured wrist rather than something far worse. The crane itself was taken out of service immediately pending an actual, physical, verified inspection, the first one it had genuinely received in over 2 years. Renata heard about the incident within hours. She finished her file that same night, working past midnight, because she now understood with complete clarity that this was no longer a financial irregularity she could afford to keep documenting quietly and cautiously. It was an active, ongoing safety risk across 5 other plants, with at least 5 more pieces of equipment she suspected hadn't been genuinely inspected in years. The next morning, she requested an emergency meeting with Ironclad's VP of Operations, a woman named Diane Castellano, bypassing Gary entirely and stating exactly why in her message. I have documentation showing a pattern of fabricated safety inspections across multiple plants, connected to yesterday's crane incident in Tennessee. This needs immediate review above the safety department. I'm available within the hour. Diane called her within 15 minutes. Renata laid out the file, starting immediately with the 6 specific pieces of equipment she believed were currently in service without a genuine, verified inspection, given what had just happened in Tennessee. Then the site access discrepancy across all 210 inspections. Then, last, the LLC ownership connection to Gary, framed with careful precision. I want to be clear, this is what the public filing shows. I'm not asserting Gary's direct involvement in the physical fraud, only that he holds what appears to be a financial interest in the company that was paid for work I can now show largely didn't happen. Diane didn't wait 48 hours. Given the active safety risk, she pulled in the company's general counsel and head of operations within the hour, and by that afternoon, physical inspectors from an entirely different, independently verified contractor were already being dispatched to the 6 flagged machines across 3 plants, with 2 additional plants added to the emergency review list by the end of the day, out of pure caution. What the emergency inspections found over the following week confirmed the worst of what Renata's paperwork analysis had suggested. Of the 6 specific machines she'd flagged, 4 had genuine, serious safety deficiencies that a real inspection would have caught and required repaired years earlier. Worn cables, corroded structural supports, malfunctioning safety interlocks on equipment that had been quietly deteriorating while a piece of paper insisted everything was fine. Gary Holloway was placed on administrative leave that same week, once the LLC ownership connection was independently verified by legal counsel. The leave became a termination within 10 days, given that the fraud involved falsified federal and state safety compliance documentation, not just ordinary financial misconduct. The matter was referred to both state prosecutors and the relevant occupational safety regulatory body, whose own investigators opened a parallel review, specifically because falsified certification records for this category of industrial equipment carried regulatory consequences well beyond what a typical financial fraud case would involve. Sentinel Compliance Services lost its certification entirely once regulators reviewed the pattern, effectively ending the company. Gary's case moved slowly through both the criminal and regulatory process over the following year, eventually resulting in a plea agreement that included substantial restitution, a permanent bar from holding any safety-related compliance role in manufacturing, and a suspended sentence contingent on that restitution being paid in full. Ruben Alvarez, the maintenance technician injured in the Tennessee incident, recovered fully from his fractured wrist over several months, and Ironclad's legal team ensured his medical costs and lost wages during recovery recovered well beyond what standard workers' compensation alone would have provided. Renata was promoted into a newly created Director of Compliance Verification role, with new authority to conduct independent, unannounced physical spot checks on any third-party inspection contractor across all 6 plants, reporting directly to Diane's office, rather than through the safety department's own regional structure. Some months later, walking a new safety coordinator through the updated verification process, Renata found herself explaining why the new system required physically confirmed site visits cross-checked against security logs, rather than simply trusting signed paperwork from a long-standing, reputable vendor. "Paper only tells you what someone wanted you to believe happened," she said. "For 3 years, our paper said everything was fine. The equipment didn't care what the paper said. It just kept wearing down exactly the way it would have worn down whether anyone signed anything or not. The only thing that actually protects anyone on that factory floor is someone occasionally showing up in person to check whether the paper and the machine agree with each other. If you've ever trusted a piece of paperwork because the person behind it had a good reputation, and something about it quietly didn't sit right anyway, trust that feeling. Reputations are built once and coasted on for years. The paperwork either matches reality or it doesn't, and reality, eventually, always finds a way to show its work. Keep your file. Keep your receipts. Some signatures are worth checking twice.